Studies Section 2. Profile of the Nigeria Economy. Introduction. The Nigerian economic growth has not been consistent. In this studies section, you will explore economic growth pattern of Nigeria since pre-independence era to date. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this studies section, you should be able to discuss the growth experience of the Nigerian economy from the colonial period to the present, comment on the growth in various sectors of the economy as well as the structural changes in the economy. Economic growth of Nigeria. The growth experience of Nigeria will be reviewed in this order: pre-independence era, independence era, pre-oil boom era, oil boom era, SAP era, and the post-SAP era. Pre-independence era. Before independence in 1960, the economy of Nigeria was characterized by the dominance of export and commercial activities. There was no viable industrial sector. Raw materials comprising of agricultural produce and minerals were exported to the industrialized countries. Also, peasant farmers produced enough to feed the entire population. In this context, the economy can be referred to as purely unindustrialized. This continued until the dawn of the independence. Independence era. Nigeria attained political independence in 1960. At this time, Nigeria had a large population, growing at a rapid rate, prevalence of low productivity growth in economic activities, inadequate social and economic infrastructure, and weakly diversified production structure dominated by primary production as agriculture and low per capita income and living standards. All these conditions give some insight into the complexity of the process of economic development and growth in the country at independence. Agriculture continued to be the mainstay of the economy. It contributed about 65% of GDP and represented almost 70% of total exports. The main thrust of policy was to maximize the benefits of the export-led development strategy. Import substitution industrialization (ISI) strategy was adopted. As a result, various items that were imported before were now produced within the domestic economy. Protective measures like tariffs, quotas, etc. were in place, addressing the features of the economy at the period, which were narrow, disarticulated production base with ill-adapted technology, neglected informal sector, lopsided development due to the bias of public policies, openness and excessive dependence on external factor inputs, continuous siphoning of surplus of the economy, and weak institutional capabilities. Question: is there any difference in the growth pattern of the Nigerian economy between pre-independence and independence era? If yes, mention any observed difference. Feedback. There is no clear-cut difference in growth pattern of the Nigerian economy between these two periods, except that Nigeria attained complete sovereignty in the independence era when compared with the pre-independence era. Oil boom era. The discovery of oil in commercial quantities in the mid-1950s, coupled with the oil boom resulting from the Arab oil embargo on the USA in 1973, adversely affected the agricultural sector. The economy became heavily dependent on oil, and revenue from oil accounted for almost 90% of foreign exchange earnings and almost 85% of total exports. The oil boom generated needed revenue for the government and also created serious structural problems in the economy. The competitiveness of agricultural sector in the world market was eroded by overvalued naira exchange rate, inadequate pricing policies, rural-urban migration, and neglect of the sector due to the earlier stated oil boom. The public sector became the prime mover of the economy through huge investment of growing oil revenue in physical, economic, and social infrastructure, such that 1980, the government accounted for about 50% of GDP and over 70% of modern sector development. In the middle of 1981, however, the world oil market began to collapse, leading to falls in oil prices. Consequently, the external reserves of the economy fell sharply and foreign debt mounted as a result of rising imports. Moreover, inappropriate and ineffective policies of government for economic stabilization aggravated the problem. Supply of raw materials and spare parts were reduced, and the resulting effect was extensive plant closure in the economy's import-dependent industries. Thus, by the end of 1985, real GDP and consumption has fallen below their 1979 levels, and external debt service obligations rose to 32.02% of exports. The government then introduced an economic recovery program called the Structural Adjustment Program, SAP, in July 1986. Question: what were the challenges confronted by the agricultural sector during the oil boom era? Feedback: some of the challenges that confronted agricultural sector during the oil boom era include overvalued naira exchange rate, inadequate pricing policies, rural-urban migration, and neglect of the sector due to the earlier oil boom SAP era. The Structural Adjustment Program of July 1986 was introduced to restructure the economy, which was inevitable following its poor performance in the early 80s. The program was aimed at changing and realigning aggregate domestic expenditure and production patterns so as to minimize dependence on import, enhance the non-oil export base, and bring the economy back on the path of steady and balanced growth. Specifically, the objectives of the program were restructuring and diversifying the productive base of the economy in order to reduce the dependence on oil sector and imports, laying the basis for a sustainable non-inflationary growth, achieving fiscal and balance of payment viability over the short and medium term, improving the efficiency of public sector and intensifying the growth of the private sector. The SAP appeared to have intensified speculative and trading activities rather than increasing production. The private sector, which was supposed to serve as the engine of growth during the period, was not able to respond adequately to the desire for increased production, employment, and stable prices. Its share of manufacturing in GDP was still low, while capacity utilization was a little above 30%. 8 years into the adjustment program, non-oil exports still remain insignificant. Some gains were undoubtedly achieved during the SAP period, but the program brought about a number of problems which were unbearable for the Nigerians. The program was intended to be a long-term program which would gradually restructure the economy, but the operators of the program lacked commitment to its long-term achievable goals. This made an immediate review of the program inevitable. Post-SAP period. In the periods following the failure of SAP to achieve its set goals and objectives, The dual exchange regime was introduced specifically in 1995 as an attempt to redress the continuous depreciation of the domestic currency. As a follow-up, the CBN intervened in the operation of the autonomous market to ensure that it was adequately funded. Between 1994 and 1998, the real GDP grew steadily from 101.0 billion naira to 113 billion naira. The annual growth rates were 1.3% in 1994, 2.2% in 1995, 3.3% in 1996, 3.8% in 1997, and 2.4% in 1998. Despite this growth, the Nigerian economy was unable to create enough employment opportunities for citizens who were able and willing to work. The rate of inflation during this period increased from 57% in 1994 to 72.8% in 1996. It reduced again to 8.5% in 1997. Therefore, prices were generally unstable during the period. The real GDP as at 1995 was 103,078.6 million naira, and this increased to 121,207.8 million naira in 2000. GDP as at the 1990 factor cost was 576 million in 2004. This increased by 6.2% in 2005 to 285 million. It later increased to 43.7 million in 2006. Question: SAP and post-SAP era can both be said to be the same in terms of growth pattern. True or false? Why choosing your answer? Feedback: true. Both SAP and post-SAP are the same in terms of growth pattern because they are both characterized by fluctuations in output growth rate and inflation growth rate. Contribution of various sectors to the economic growth of Nigeria. Economic growth and development, among its other objectives, encompass a sustained rise in the productive capacity of the economy and real output per capita as a basis for a sustained, improved and higher living standards and quality of life for the population. In order to analyze the growth and development of economic activities in Nigeria, the sectors of the economy which should be examined include agriculture, crude petroleum, manufacturing, utilities, distribution, finance and insurance, housing, producers of government services, hotel and restaurants, communication, transportation, building and construction, mining and quarrying, real estate and business services, and community, social and personal services. Emphasis will be placed on the manufacturing, agriculture, and the crude oil sectors. Between 1916 and 1970, the agricultural sector dominated the economy. The contribution of agriculture to GDP was 61.6% in 1961 to 1962. This was followed by the distribution sector at 12.2% and transportation and communication 5.4%. However, by 1968, the share of agriculture in the GDP had fallen to 49%. The share of services in the GDP in 1968 was 34%, while industry at 17%. The share of manufacturing in the same year was 4%, and this was limited to primary processing of raw materials for export and production of simple consumer items. The oil sector in this period was existing but insignificant both in terms of contribution to GDP and to exports. While total export, for example, was 339 million naira in 1960, crude oil accounted for only 9 million naira, which was just 2.65% of total exports. This percentage, however, increased to 25.32% in 1965, reaching up to 57.56% in 1970. The growth rate of the oil sector during the later period of immediate post-independence decade accounted for the increase in the percentage share of the industry in the GDP from 17% in 1968 to 30% in 1970. The contribution of manufacturing to GDP remained at 4% in 1970, while the share of services had fallen to 28%. In the period 1960 to 1970, nominal GDP rose from 2,400 million naira to 5,621 million naira. Agriculture maintained the lead in the contribution to the national income until 1975 at 36%, followed by mining and quarrying at 33.1%. However, in 1975, the share of agriculture fell to 23.4% and further to 20.8% in 1980, while the percentage share of mining and quarrying, majorly petroleum, rose to 45.4% in 1975. The dramatic increase in the oil prices and the rise in the nation's proven oil reserves and production brought the mining and quarrying sector into great prominence. In 1970, the contribution of crude petroleum sector to export earnings was 57.56%, and by 1975, this percentage increased to 95.88% and 96% in 1980, dominating the entire export trade. This made the sector the major foreign exchange earner and the prime mover of the economy. The distribution sector contributed significantly to GDP in the colonial era. The share in GDP, though, fell from 12.2% in 1961 to 1962 to 9.45% in 1970 to 1971 and 7% in 1975. Therefore, there was massive increase in the contribution of building and construction sector to GDP between 1970 and 1980. The sector share rose from 3.5% in 1970 to 1971 to 5.7% in 1975 and 18.75% in 1980. This was attributed to the post-war reconstruction. The contribution of manufacturing to GDP remained unimpressive between 1970 and 1980 at 5.9% in 1970 to 1971, 4.7% in 1975, and 6.8% in 1980. Nominal GDP in 1970 was 5,621 million naira, 2,1779 million naira in 1975, and 50849 million naira in 1980. The growth in GDP is attributed to the fortune that came from intensive production and sale of crude oil. On the other hand, in the decade following 1980s, agricultural sector resumed its dominance of the national economy in terms of percentage share of GDP. The share was 20.8% in 1980, but rose to 34.7% in 1981, 40.3% in 1985, and 39.05% on 1990. The average annual growth rate of the sector was 3.9%. The contribution of crude petroleum to GDP fell from 27% in 1980 to 14.01% in 1981 and 12.90% in 1990. Crude petroleum remained the major foreign exchange earner at 96.89% in 1981 and 97.03% in 1990. The building and construction sector that had witnessed a profound growth in the preceding decade experienced recess, declining both in absolute value and in the share of GDP from 18.75% in 1979 to 1980 to 4.7% in 1981 and further to 1.90% in 1985. The share stood at 1.91% in 1990. The decline in the sectorial performance may be due to austerity measures of the early 1980s and later SAP and its associating high cost of materials. The share of distribution in the GDP fell also from 18.75% in 1980 to 13.0% in 1985 and further down to 12.72% in 1990. In this decade, hotel and restaurants, housing, real estate, and business services emerged to become significant contributors to GDP. The massive growth of the finance and insurance sector, especially in the later half of the period, can be attributed to the deregulation of the industry under the SAP. Nominal GDP stood at 5849 million naira in 1980 and increased to 260637 million naira in 1990. The growth in GDP after the introduction of SAP from 72355 million naira in 1985 to 260637 million naira in 1990 is noteworthy. The structure of national income between 1991 and 1995 followed the same pattern as that of the preceding decade. Agriculture and its allies still maintain the highest level of contribution to GDP, 39.44% in 1991, 39.34% in 1995, followed by petroleum, 13.44% in 1991, and 12.44% in 1995. Crude petroleum also remained the major foreign exchange earner in the economy, followed closely by distribution at 12% in 1991 and 12.60% in 1995. Finance and insurance stood at 8.67% in 1991 and 9.19% in 1995. The nominal national income increased from 32.429 million US dollar in 1990 to 32.695 million US dollar in 1991 and fell to 31.814 million US dollar in 1993. It increased to 65.312 US dollar in 1995. Earnings from agricultural exports rose from 15.5 billion naira in 1995 to 16.3 billion naira in 1998, whereas earnings from crude oil export fell from 927.5 billion naira to 717.8 billion naira within the same period. In 1990, agriculture contributed 39.0% to GDP, manufacturing contributed 8.2%, while crude oil contributed 12.8%. A decade later, 2000, the contribution of agriculture fell to 35.7%, the share of manufacturing also fell to 3.4%, and crude oil became the leading sector in the economy with GDP share of 47.5%. In 2002, however, the share of agriculture stood at 28.35% of the GDP. Manufacturing sector had an increase to 5.5%, and the contribution of the crude oil sector fell to 40.6%. The present decade is witnessing a situation of paralyzed industrial real sector with heavy dependence on imports, mostly of consumable goods, e.g. rice. The middle quarter of the decade was characterized by increases in the world oil prices 2007 to 2008, and then the present global economic crisis of September 2008 till date have reduced drastically the earnings from crude oil. The Nigerian economy is heavily dominated by the financial sector due to the consolidation in the sector in 2002. The link between the real sector and the financial sector is broken, and the real sector of the economy is suffering from neglect both in terms of policies of government, infrastructures, and private investments. The country's dependence on oil revenue must reduce because of the fluctuations in the world oil market price and the non-renewable nature of the product, as well as research and development on various oil substitutes all over the world. In order to achieve a diversified economy with minimal dependence on the oil sector, the real sector and the agricultural sector of the economy must be developed. For agriculture to play its desired role in the development process in Nigeria, particularly in ensuring a substantial increase in the sector so as to enhance better nutritional standards, economic policies should facilitate the expansion of the productive capacity and domestic and foreign marketing channels. The Nigerian economy appears to have performed well during the 1960s as shown by GDP growth rate of inflation, and unemployment rates. During the period, agriculture was the mainstay of the economy despite fluctuations in export prices. The oil boom period witnessed remarkable growth rates, yet the boom had no impact on the real sector since the industrial sector remained relatively weak. The windfall from oil appeared not to have been utilized in shoring up the industrial sector. Therefore, when the recession of the 1980s set in, the economy found itself unable to absorb the shocks from declining oil prices. The subsequent economic reform programs still had serious problems. Nigeria's economy remains such that real wages could not meet basic requirements. Social services deteriorated at an alarming rate, and the real sector was not linked to the so-called boom in the financial sector. Nonetheless, given the country's solid resource base, the commitment of its new political and leadership class, and given the appropriate policy mix, the economy may, in the near future, experience meaningful growth and development which can guarantee a high standard of living for the citizens. The present democratic dispensation certainly offers some hope if only the economy is properly managed. Modern economic growth involves significant and systematic changes in economic structure, essentially in three key areas, namely output, employment, and exports. The case in Nigeria from 1960s has been instability in the structure of the economy in form of fluctuation in sectorial production pattern. Question: which sector of the Nigerian economy is referred to as the real sector? Feedback: the real sector in the Nigerian economy is best described as the industrial sector. Changing structure of the Nigerian economy. Varying contributions of sectors to GDP and the varying dependence of the economy on the sector. Agriculture dominates the GDP, but its contribution has gradually reduced over the years since the attainment of political independence in 1960, with the sector having a share in GDP of 64.1% in 1960. This share declined to 48.8% in 1970, to 22.2% in 1980, and to 39.3% in 1995. By 2002, the ratio was 28.2%. Manufacturing sector improved in the early post-independence years, but its contribution fell in the 1990s from 4.8% in 1660 to 5.5% in 2002. Manufacturing sector improved in the early post-independence years, but its contribution fell in the 1990s from 4.8% in 1960 to 5.5% in 2002. The crude oil sector became prominent, contributing to GDP 1.2% in 1960. On the other hand, the structure of the economic change to dependence on oil and mining between 1970 and 1980. The contribution of the oil sector rose from a mere 1.2% in 1960 to 10.1% in 1970 and to 26.8% in 1980. The ratio was 40.6% in 2002. In the present decade, the structure of the economy is characterized by a vibrant financial system that has had cycles of stability, prosperity, and distress. The latter pronounced in the early to mid-1990s. The improved enforcement of regulation and increasing commitment to corporate governance principles by the operators brought about soundness of the financial system development. External trade is dominated by oil, which accounted for 32.9% of the total in 1970 and 64.3% in 2002. Question: which sector of the economy overthrew agriculture as the mainstay of the Nigerian economy? Feedback: the crude oil sector, following the oil boom of 1970s, overthrew agriculture as the mainstay of the Nigerian economy. Although the transient oil boom and the euphoria of industrializing rapidly based on the large inflow of foreign exchange earnings from oil exports, it is known that industrial transition is yet to occur effectively in Nigeria. The Nigerian government should embark on policies to develop both the agriculture and manufacturing sectors of the economy with the right social and economic environment to enable this. Studies section summary. In this studies section, we observed that Nigerian economic performance and characteristics can be analyzed from two major perspectives: period before independence and after independence. You learned that Nigerian economy is monoculture economy as it solely depends on oil as a source of foreign exchange earnings and revenue generation. There are some peculiar characteristics that are associated with the Nigerian economy. These are duality, monocultural economy, high index of openness. This is the end of section 2. Thanks for listening.